Most people assume that if someone wants a future with them, they'll say it. They'll make a grand gesture. They'll confess everything that's on their mind. But that's not how human behavior usually works. In reality, people reveal major intentions in subtle ways long before they ever find the courage to put those intentions into words. This is where most people get confused. They spend all of their attention listening to what someone says while completely overlooking what that person's nervous system is communicating every single time they're together. When someone begins imagining a larger place for you in their life, their behavior often changes before they're consciously aware of why it's changing. They start making decisions that include you without announcing it. They remember details that seemed insignificant when you first mentioned them. They become curious about routines, habits, and goals that have nothing to do with the present moment because, consciously or not, they're trying to understand how you fit into the bigger picture. Notice the difference between curiosity and investment. Curiosity asks questions because something is interesting. Investment asks questions because the answers could matter later. That's a distinction almost everyone misses. Imagine two conversations that sound nearly identical. In one, someone casually asks where you grew up. In another, they ask how your childhood shaped the way you make important decisions today. Those aren't the same question. The second reaches beyond information. It's searching for patterns. People planning for the future don't just collect facts. They collect predictability. Behavioral science has shown repeatedly that the brain is constantly trying to reduce uncertainty. We feel more comfortable when we can predict someone's reactions, values, and emotional patterns. So when someone consistently seeks to understand those deeper layers of who you are, it can indicate they're placing increasing importance on your role in their life. Another signal is consistency. Intensity is exciting, but consistency is revealing. Anyone can be affectionate during an emotional high. Anyone can seem deeply interested for a weekend, a vacation, or the excitement of something new. What's much harder to fake is showing up the same way over time. Consistency requires intention. If communication remains steady without becoming forced, if they continue reaching out even when there's no immediate reward, if they remember conversations from weeks ago and naturally build on them, those patterns often tell you more than dramatic declarations ever could. The human brain naturally invests energy where it expects value. Time is one of the clearest indicators of that investment because time cannot be recovered once it's spent. Watch for future-oriented language too. Not promises, not guarantees. Just the subtle shift in wording. Instead of saying you should try that restaurant, they might say, we should go there sometime. Instead of asking about your weekend, they become interested in your plans months from now. Instead of focusing only on today's conversation, they begin referencing experiences that haven't happened yet. These moments aren't proof of anything by themselves. Context matters. But when several of these patterns appear together over time, they may suggest that someone is naturally picturing you in scenarios that extend beyond the present. One of the strongest indicators is comfort. Many people think attraction is all about excitement. Excitement matters, but comfort is what allows connection to deepen. When people begin seeing someone as a stable part of their lives, they often stop performing. They become less concerned with impressing and more interested in being understood. Their stories become more honest. Their imperfections become more visible. They laugh at themselves more often. They admit uncertainty. They don't feel the need to win every disagreement. That doesn't happen because attraction disappears. It often happens because psychological safety increases. Safety changes behavior. In high-pressure situations, people monitor every word they say. They calculate every move. But as trust develops, cognitive load decreases. They spend less energy managing impressions and more energy participating in the interaction itself. This is why relaxed behavior can sometimes reveal more than polished behavior. Pay attention to emotional availability as well. When something important happens, good or bad, who comes to mind? Many people instinctively reach out to those they associate with stability, understanding, or encouragement. If someone consistently includes you in those moments, it may reflect growing emotional significance. That doesn't necessarily mean romance. It does suggest that your presence carries weight in their internal world. There's another pattern that often surprises people. Small acts of consideration. Not dramatic sacrifices. Not expensive gifts. Tiny adjustments. They remember how you take your coffee. They send an article because it reminded them of a conversation you had weeks ago. They avoid scheduling over a time they know matters to you. They make room for your preferences without announcing that they're doing it. These behaviors are easy to dismiss because each one seems insignificant in isolation. Yet human relationships are built from accumulated moments rather than isolated grand gestures. Think about the people who matter most in your own life. Is it one spectacular event that created the bond? Or was it hundreds of small moments that quietly demonstrated reliability? The answer is usually the second. Behavior follows priority more often than emotion follows words. That's why experienced behavioral observers spend less time analyzing declarations and more time studying repeated actions. Patterns are harder to fake than performances. Anyone can rehearse confidence. Few people can consistently maintain behaviors that contradict their genuine priorities over long periods. This is why observing trends is so much more useful than interpreting isolated moments. Ask yourself what happens across weeks, not minutes. Across months, not messages. Across real life, not imagination. Because that's where meaningful patterns become visible. There's another behavior that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and that's synchronization. Human beings naturally begin to mirror the people they feel connected to, often without realizing they're doing it. This isn't about copying someone in an obvious way. It's much more subtle. Speech rhythms become similar. Humor starts to overlap. Even the timing of pauses in conversation can begin to align. Researchers who study rapport have long observed that people who feel psychologically connected tend to coordinate their behavior in ways that happen beneath conscious awareness. They lean in at similar moments. They smile in response to one another almost automatically. They adjust their pace to match the other person's comfort level. On its own, none of these behaviors proves romantic interest. But when several of these signals appear repeatedly, alongside consistent investment, they can indicate that the relationship is becoming increasingly important to the other person. One of the easiest mistakes to make is confusing excitement with commitment. Excitement seeks novelty. Commitment seeks stability. Someone can be incredibly enthusiastic for a short period because everything feels new. But once novelty fades, their attention disappears as well. That's why psychologists often emphasize looking beyond emotional highs and paying attention to what remains after those highs settle. If someone continues making room for you once everyday life returns, that's often more informative than any passionate declaration made during an emotional peak. The brain is remarkably efficient. It doesn't continue investing resources into people who occupy little importance. Attention naturally follows perceived value. Think about how memory works. You mention a goal in passing several weeks ago. Then, without prompting, they ask how it's progressing. They remember the name of your coworker. They recall a book you wanted to read. They bring up something you almost forgot you ever mentioned. That level of recall usually requires more than hearing the information. It requires mentally revisiting it. People revisit information that matters to them. Again, context is everything. Some individuals naturally possess exceptional memories. Others intentionally practice active listening. But when detailed recall consistently centers around you, it may suggest that you're occupying more mental space than you realize. Then there's planning. Not dramatic planning. Ordinary planning. They ask whether you'll be free next month before committing to something. They naturally include you when discussing upcoming events. Instead of assuming your schedule doesn't matter, they check it first. These small behaviors communicate something subtle, yet meaningful. They're considering your availability as part of their own decision-making process. That's different from simply inviting someone somewhere. It's integrating another person's life into your own planning process. Behavioral psychologists sometimes describe relationships as systems rather than isolated interactions. As relationships deepen, people's routines begin overlapping. Decisions become increasingly interconnected. That overlap develops gradually. Rarely does it happen overnight. Watch how someone responds when unexpected problems arise. Stress reveals priorities in ways comfort often cannot. Under pressure, people have less mental energy available for impression management. Their automatic habits become easier to observe. Do they disappear completely whenever life becomes difficult? Or do they still make an effort to communicate, even briefly? A simple message saying, "Busy day, but I didn't want you wondering where I went," communicates something very different from unexplained silence. Neither guarantees anything, but one behavior demonstrates awareness of another person's experience. Awareness is one of the building blocks of emotional investment. Here's another pattern many people overlook. Protective behavior. This doesn't mean controlling behavior. Healthy protectiveness respects another person's independence while still caring about their well-being. Maybe they remind you to text when you get home safely. Maybe they notice you're overwhelmed before you mention it. Maybe they encourage you to rest after hearing how demanding your week has been. These actions aren't necessarily romantic. Friends do them too. But when they consistently accompany increasing emotional closeness, they may reflect growing care and concern. The key word is consistency. Anyone can perform kindness once. Patterns require sustained motivation. Notice whether they become genuinely interested in the people who matter to you. They ask about your family. They remember your closest friends. They celebrate someone else's success because they know that person's happiness affects yours. That's an important shift. They're no longer viewing your life as separate from theirs. They're beginning to understand your social world as part of understanding you. Behavioral science consistently reminds us that humans don't exist in isolation. Every meaningful relationship exists within a network of other relationships. Someone imagining a larger role in your life often becomes curious about that network, not because they're gathering information for its own sake, but because context helps people predict experiences more accurately. Now consider vulnerability. Many people believe vulnerability simply means sharing painful stories. Sometimes it does, but vulnerability also includes admitting uncertainty, saying, "I don't know," admitting mistakes, asking for advice, requesting reassurance. These behaviors require trust because they involve temporarily lowering psychological defenses. The stronger the trust, the easier those moments become. That's why emotional openness often grows gradually rather than appearing all at once. If someone starts inviting you into conversations they once kept private, they are allowing you access to parts of their internal world that aren't available to everyone. That doesn't happen accidentally. It happens because the perceived risk of openness is increasingly outweighed by the expectation of acceptance. Notice how disagreements are handled. Conflict isn't the opposite of connection. Indifference is. People who see value in a relationship usually attempt to repair misunderstandings rather than simply walking away from every difficult conversation. Repair attempts are among the most powerful indicators of relational investment. That repair might be an apology, a clarifying conversation, a joke that softens tension, or simply reaching out after emotions have cooled. The important part isn't perfection, it's willingness. Willingness communicates that preserving the relationship matters more than protecting the past ego. And perhaps that's one of the strongest behavioral themes you'll ever observe. When someone's actions repeatedly prioritize understanding over winning, cooperation over distance, and consistency over intensity, you're often looking at patterns that deserve attention. Not because they guarantee a specific future, but because meaningful relationships are rarely built on dramatic moments alone. They're built through countless ordinary choices that, over time, reveal extraordinary levels of intention. One of the biggest misconceptions about human connection is that important feelings always arrive with obvious signals. In reality, people are often the last to recognize the full meaning of their own emotions. The brain doesn't always announce, "This person matters." Instead, it quietly changes behavior first. That's why seasoned behavioral observers spend less time looking for dramatic declarations and more time watching repeated habits. Habits are difficult to fake. Anyone can create a memorable moment. Very few people can consistently behave in ways that require ongoing emotional investment, without that investment existing somewhere beneath the surface. Think about attention. Attention is one of the most valuable psychological resources we possess. Every day, thousands of things compete for it. Notifications, responsibilities, deadlines, conversations, decisions. Yet despite all of that competition, certain people continue appearing in someone's thoughts. How do you know? Not because they say, "I've been thinking about you," because their actions quietly reveal it. They send something that connects to a conversation from days ago. They remember an inside joke. They notice when your mood changes before you mention it. They ask follow-up questions instead of repeating questions you've already answered. That last point deserves more attention than it usually receives. Follow-up questions indicate continuity. Continuity suggests that previous conversations remained active in memory. In other words, your interactions didn't simply end when the conversation ended. The brain kept processing them afterward. Behavioral psychology often focuses on salience, the tendency for meaningful information to stand out and remain mentally accessible. People naturally revisit memories associated with experiences they consider important. That doesn't necessarily mean romance. It does suggest significance. And significance is where deeper relationships often begin. Now consider something even more subtle. Respect for your boundaries. Many people assume closeness means eliminating boundaries. Healthy relationships usually do the opposite. They recognize and respect them. If you say you need time to focus on work, they don't immediately interpret it as rejection. If you need an evening to yourself, they don't create unnecessary conflict. Instead, They demonstrate confidence that temporary distance doesn't threaten the connection. Psychological security often appears as patience rather than pressure. Someone who values long-term connection generally understands that trust cannot be rushed. It grows through repeated experiences that confirm reliability. Reliability is surprisingly attractive because it reduces uncertainty. Remember, the human brain is constantly predicting. Can I depend on this person? Will they respond consistently? Do their words and actions align? Every positive answer strengthens confidence. Every contradiction weakens it. That's why congruence matters so much. Congruence simply means alignment. If someone repeatedly says they care but disappears whenever accountability appears, their behavior creates confusion. If they consistently communicate, follow through, and respect commitments, their actions reinforce credibility. Behavior creates trust. Words explain it. Never confuse the order. Here's another interesting observation. Notice how someone reacts to your success. This reveals more than many people realize. When another person's achievements genuinely bring someone joy, it often reflects emotional generosity rather than competition. They celebrate promotions, encourage goals, recognize progress, ask questions about what's next. Their excitement isn't forced, it's shared. Psychologists sometimes describe close relationships as interconnected emotional systems. When one person experiences something meaningful, the other naturally becomes emotionally engaged as well. That's why genuine enthusiasm feels different from polite congratulations. One comes from obligation. The other comes from investment. Investment changes attention. Investment changes priorities. Investment changes behavior. And behavior is always easier to observe than hidden intentions. There's also the question of emotional regulation. When people value a relationship, they often become more thoughtful about how they communicate during moments of frustration. Not because they never feel irritated, everyone does, but because they understand that temporary emotions shouldn't permanently damage something meaningful. That awareness influences tone, timing, word choice. People who care about preserving connection usually recognize that being right isn't always the same as being effective. Sometimes protecting understanding matters more than winning an argument. This requires emotional maturity. It also requires seeing the relationship as something worth protecting. Watch whether someone creates opportunities for shared experiences. Again, not elaborate plans. Simple ones. A walk, coffee, a recommendation for a movie followed by, tell me what you think. A conversation about trying something new together someday. Shared experiences create shared memories. Shared memories strengthen familiarity. Familiarity increases comfort. Comfort often encourages deeper openness. Notice how naturally this progression unfolds. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just one ordinary interaction leading to another until a meaningful pattern quietly develops. Another overlooked signal involves emotional curiosity. Do they only ask about events, or do they ask how those events affected you? There's a profound difference. What happened? And how did that make you feel? The second question seeks emotional understanding rather than factual information. People who consistently seek emotional understanding are often attempting to build a more accurate mental model of who you are beneath the surface. That process takes effort. It requires listening, remembering, comparing experiences over time, adjusting previous assumptions. The brain doesn't spend that much energy on everyone. It reserves that effort for relationships perceived as valuable. Perhaps one of the strongest indicators of growing importance is this. Your absence becomes noticeable. Not in an unhealthy or possessive way, simply because routines have changed. People adapt to meaningful presences. When those presences temporarily disappear, attention naturally notices the difference. Maybe they check in after realizing they haven't heard from you. Maybe they ask whether everything is okay. Maybe they simply say they enjoyed talking with you and wanted to reconnect. These behaviors don't prove someone's long-term intentions, but they do demonstrate awareness. Awareness is often the first visible expression of increasing emotional significance. Relationships rarely transform in a single defining moment. More often, they evolve through dozens of nearly invisible moments that seem ordinary while they're re-happening. Only later do people realize those small moments were quietly changing everything. That's why careful observation matters. Not observation driven by anxiety. Not observation searching for certainty where none exists. But observation that pays attention to consistent patterns instead of isolated incidents. Because when behavior remains steady across changing circumstances, different moods, busy schedules, and ordinary days, It often tells a far more accurate story than any single emotional conversation ever could. There is another layer to this that most people never stop to consider. Human beings don't simply form opinions about other people. They begin organizing parts of their lives around them. At first, those adjustments are almost invisible. A person may shift their schedule to make time for a conversation. They may remember when you're usually available. They may naturally think of you when something interesting happens because your growth at you. I'll become part of the way they process their day. None of these behaviors, on their own, can tell you exactly what someone feels. But together, repeated over time, they often reveal that the relationship carries growing importance. The brain creates mental shortcuts for what matters. Think about the people closest to you. You don't have to consciously remind yourself to check in with them. It becomes automatic because your mind has already categorized those relationships as significant. That same process can happen gradually in any meaningful connection. Behavior often shifts long before anyone consciously labels those feelings. This is why experienced interviewers, negotiators, and behavioral analysts avoid becoming overly focused on dramatic moments. They know that reliable information usually appears in ordinary interactions. The ordinary is difficult to manufacture. Consistency leaves fingerprints. Imagine someone who regularly notices subtle changes in your mood. You don't announce that you're having a difficult day. You don't complain. Yet they ask whether everything is okay because something about your energy feels different. That level of observation usually requires familiarity. Familiarity requires attention. Attention requires value. Again, none of these ideas should be treated as certainty. People vary widely in how expressive they are, and personality, culture, and circumstances all influence behavior. The key is not to treat any single sign as proof, but to notice recurring patterns across time. Another revealing behavior involves remembering emotional details rather than just factual ones. Almost anyone can remember that you have a meeting on Thursday if you reminded them yesterday. But remembering that public speaking makes you nervous because of an experience you shared months ago, that reflects a different level of listening. Emotional information tends to stick when someone has assigned importance to the person sharing it. The human mind naturally prioritizes information connected to emotionally meaningful relationships. Notice whether conversations evolve naturally. Early conversations often stay on safe topics: favorite movies, work, travel, food. As trust grows, discussions usually become more reflective. Values, purpose, regrets, lessons learned, dreams that haven't yet become reality. When someone voluntarily explores those deeper conversations, they're often signaling that the relationship feels emotionally safe enough to support them. Psychological safety is one of the strongest predictors of authentic communication. People reveal more when they expect understanding rather than judgment. Another interesting observation concerns laughter. Shared laughter does more than create enjoyable moments. It synchronizes attention. It reduces stress. It strengthens feelings of social connection. Behavioral researchers have repeatedly found that laughter often serves as a social bonding mechanism rather than simply a response to humor. That's why two people can laugh together over something that no one else finds particularly funny. The joke isn't always the point. The shared experience is. Then consider responsiveness. How someone responds often matters more than how quickly they respond. Do they engage thoughtfully? Do they ask questions? Do they build on what you've said? Or do conversations repeatedly feel one-sided? Quality consistently outweighs quantity. A brief but attentive conversation often reveals more investment than dozens of distracted exchanges. Meaningful communication leaves both people feeling understood. One of the strongest habits associated with healthy relationships is curiosity without interrogation. There's an important distinction. Interrogation seeks control. Curiosity seeks understanding. Someone who asks thoughtful questions while respecting your comfort level is creating space for genuine connection instead of trying to force it. That balance is difficult to fake because it requires emotional awareness. Watch for moments when they naturally advocate for your success. Perhaps they recommend you for an opportunity. Perhaps they encourage a goal you've been hesitant to pursue. Perhaps they remind you of strengths you've forgotten during moments of self-doubt. Support isn't always loud. Often it's quiet, steady, and remarkably consistent. The people who genuinely care about your growth usually don't feel threatened by it. Instead, they become one more source of encouragement along the journey. This reflects what psychologists sometimes call secure investment. Rather than viewing another person's success as competition, They experience satisfaction in seeing someone they value make progress. Observe how someone behaves when there's nothing to gain. This is where motivations often become clearest. Do they still reach out when you're unable to help them? Do they still show interest when the conversation isn't centered on them? Do they remain engaged during ordinary weeks, not just exciting ones? Behavior that continues without immediate reward often carries greater informational value, because it's less likely to be driven by convenience. The strongest relationships are rarely built on extraordinary events alone. They're reinforced by dependable patterns repeated across ordinary days. Perhaps that's why the smallest gestures often become the most memorable. A simple message before an important meeting, remembering a meaningful anniversary in your life, checking in after a difficult conversation, celebrating progress that everyone else overlooked. None of those actions require grand declarations. They simply require attention. And attention, when given freely and consistently, is one of the clearest ways people demonstrate that someone has become an important part of their world. The challenge is resisting the temptation to interpret every positive interaction as certainty. Human behavior is nuanced. People express care differently. Some communicate through words, others through actions, others through reliability, still others through shared time. The most accurate understanding comes from looking at the complete pattern rather than searching for one perfect signal. When multiple behaviors consistently point in the same direction over an extended period, they deserve thoughtful consideration, not because they guarantee a particular future, but because stable patterns often reveal priorities more accurately than isolated moments ever can. And when someone's priorities consistently make room for your presence, your perspective, your well-being, and your growth, it's reasonable to recognize that the relationship has taken on meaningful significance in their life, even if neither of you has fully put that significance into words yet.